Okay.
No, we're waiting for one more member. Do you have a microphone on?
I forgot your name already. Patrick. So we're just waiting for one more member who's on their way upstairs. Thank you. No, we can't officially start till we have a quorum here. Thank you. Yeah, does anybody know any good, clean finance jokes? How are you? Happy New Year. I forgot, we haven't met since last year. Welcome. Now we're official. No, I think he's probably still there. Okay. Noting the time and the presence of a quorum, I hereby call this meeting of the Acton Finance Committee to order. And our first point of business is public participation.
It's Tara.
Welcome, Tara.
Bath Ave in West Acton. All right, I am due to go down to that DRB meeting to talk about land clearing limits. They are hot on the trail of figuring out what they want to do. They've got three-pronged approach. One is a delay to stop developers from clearing the entire parcel till they actually have a permit. You can see examples of this around the town, the daycare center, behind CVS. These are all places without a permit. The other one is a tree yard concept, so that some 10 feet or whatever around the edge can't be touched. And the other one is the percentage of land around on the parcel. So you choose what percentage. Anyway, they're doing that, and I'm going to go down there, but, and I want to see as much as I can of this Water Resources Advisory Committee people talking, because I have been very impressed with their work, but I'm going to say these things in case I don't get a chance later. The first thing is that I was very impressed with Ron's presentation. I think it was Ron that talked about the diminishing returns of PFAS remediation, or was that Matt? Anyway, somebody came up with these grand studies of water district infrastructure people and said that you pour money into remediating PFAS and it gets a tiny little change. So at some point, it's not worth continuing. The PFAS comes from your pans and your jackets and your sheets and your couches and everything else. It's not just your water. So to continue pouring millions and millions of dollars, am I getting that right, somewhat? Anyway, my point is when you come up to that, don't forget to talk about that, I'm hoping. And then the other thing is zoning. Stopping single-family homes or decreasing their size considerably could have a major impact on growth, unnecessary growth. The stuff that we're talking about down there would have an exception for multifamily housing that's a community need, as opposed to the market deciding just, mansions all over the place, so, which use up our water. So anyways, zoning can be the cheapest way to limit growth, the impacts of growth, including tightening up or expanding or strengthening our water protection zones. Because right now, you have zone 1 recharge places that are kind of relatively small. We're talking about, some people are talking about expanding those to protect the recharge to the wells. Is that right? Did I get that right? Something like that? Anyways, my point is that when they get to that, they talk about costs to mitigate the impact of growth, to not forget that zoning can be the free version. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else for public participation? Okay, we will move along. We'll very quickly touch on an update from myself on the MBTA housing law and how it relates to also the South Acton vision plan. And that is a growth impact subject. So I wanted to put that on the agenda right before we listen to the WRAC, which is also a growth impact. So first things first, the town has put together a South Acton Vision Committee, which I'm a part of, and I just wanted to mention that they have a working session coming up January, pardon me, and I'll pull up the date. Monday, January 23rd from 3 to 1:30 p.m., Tuesday, January 24th from 11 to 12:30 p.m., and then again from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Wednesday, January 25th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. These are at the library. This is where they are defining what the scope of the zoning changes will be once they get to a point and decide whether the town wants to comply and issue zoning changes to comply with the MBTA. So the South Acton Vision Plan will be key in saying, here's what the zoning will say. It's by right for a certain number of lots, but there have to be other constraints with regard to what the units can look like or how the units can be built. So that's what that working study, open house situation is about. Okay, so on to the MBTA housing law. Since the last time that we talked about this, when it was supposed to be 50 acres, a half mile within the train station, those rules have been eased by the state. So what we're looking at now is still 50 acres that needs to be changed to by right zoning for multifamily at a minimum density of 15 units per acre. What has changed is that within the half mile district of the train station, we only need to put 20% of that. So then outside of that district, any other parcels that we assign have to be a minimum of 5 contiguous acres. So it gives us a lot of flexibility and latitude. Jason and I would like to work up some sort of guesstimate numbers, like what is the impact of this once we enact it. There's no way we can say how many years it'll take for those to be filled, but we won't know the estimated impact until we know which parcels, right? Because the parcels that get named might already have pretty heavy density in them. And so we won't know the net effect. So it's difficult to put a number on. What numbers we can put on are numbers regarding what's the stick of the stick and the carrot. And the stick is that towns that choose not to comply with the regulation get a number of state-granted money removed from them. So there's a grant service called a one-pass service, which has a lot of the service grants that we receive. They've recently taken money out of AHA grants or AHA budget items for towns that are currently not in compliance. And so just in passing, speaking to the town manager, we know that between 2019 and 2022, we've received at least $3.5 million under these grants. So that's money that's at risk, and that doesn't begin to touch what the AHA puts in. So those are the numbers that we'd be comparing. What do we lose if we don't comply versus what's the net cost effect? So these are the things that we'll have to work on. I don't really want to belabor doing a back of the envelope calculation tonight, but I will do a rough calculation over the next week or two before we meet again to just say, okay, here's Acton's average density. If you change 50 acres of that to 15 minimum and do the ratios of how many, 22% of those would be students and X number, 25% would be senior citizens, and start working out the demographics and, we can come up with some rough numbers of how it might change financially for the town. I don't know if we'll get to the kind of dollars we're talking about for grants, though. I'm not sure that it's worth not complying. So on that note, if anybody has any questions or comments, I'll open that up.
What was that you said about 5 acres?
So in total, Acton needs to deed by right 50 acres of property for multifamily zoning at a minimum density of 15 acres.
No, 15 units per acre.
15 units per acre, thank you. Any specific parcel of land that is designated has to be a minimum of 5 contiguous acres. So you can't go and do a quarter acre plot and say, okay, that one's going to be zoned for 15 unit density, but the one next to it's not.
Are you saying that this could only happen on 5 acre lots, 5 acre plus lots, or that an area that was maybe made up of 5 single acre lots could become one of these zones?
Any lots that make up a 5 acre contiguous area of land.
So we're not just looking at what are the
qualify.
5+ acre remaining undeveloped lots in town?
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah,
Thank
yeah, good question. Okay, anything else from the Finance Committee? Tara, I'm not going to take any more public comments tonight or public questions. I'd rather not. If you could send them to him by email, and I apologize. The only reason is because we have a very long agenda this evening. So with that, Mr. Cole, did you have any comments on this?
Just saying that I think that's the right thing for us to do. We definitely want to understand both sides of it, both sides of the carrot side and the stick side. And I would like clarification that we are able to take areas that are already relatively densely zoned or relatively densely populated and see if that does actually offset the requirement. I'm very afraid of it being has to be a net new. You've said that's not the case. That's great news. That a huge step towards trying to find the maximum number of new people. So thank you for getting started with this. I want us to stay on it.
You are welcome. And that's a good point. There's nothing in the law that says it's net new zoning. You just have to change current zoning to by right and for multifamily. Yeah, it doesn't say come up with 50 new acres that currently aren't zoned for anything and suddenly make it residential multifamily. Okay, so on that note, we'll move on to agenda item number 2, which is the WRAC. And Michael Geis and Ron, what's your last name, Ron? Peretti are here to speak to us about their concerns. Oh, sorry, it's going to be all Ron. Wonderful. Thanks for joining us.
So my name is Ron Parenti. I live at 12 Heritage Road, and my wife and I have been there since 1975. By way of introduction, in the 1980s, I was part of the technical advisory committee that helped deal with the WRAC problem for the water district. Following that, I was a water commissioner for 30 years. When I stepped down from that position, I joined the Water Resource Advisory Committee, and I'm currently also a member of the Acton Water District Finance Committee. So I've been involved in water issues for a long time. So I have two charts, and the message that I want to convey, I think, is pretty straightforward. And it's simply that water issues in this town are very important to consider, especially when you think about planning for the future. And the reason I bring this to you, one of the primary reasons I bring this to you is that we've actually heard a lot of feedback from some people in town leadership that water is really not all that important. The WRAC committee in the past has gone to the select board and the manager, the town manager for funding for studies of town growth, build-out population estimates, estimates of future water demand and such. And we've been told fairly directly by a few individuals in town leadership that those kinds of studies are not important because we don't have a water problem in this town. So, and they point to the chart that I'm showing, the graph I'm showing on this chart as proof that we don't have a water issue in this town. And what I'm showing here is a historical plot of water demand over the past 15 years or so. And you'll see the green line plots out the average daily water demand averaged over the year. And as you can see, the water demand for the past 15 years has been fairly constant. And they point to that as proof that there's not an issue in town. Despite town growth, demand has not increased. But there's a big caveat that comes with this chart. And the caveat is that the red line shows you what the state of Massachusetts allows the water district to withdraw from the ground. They put a limit on what the water district is allowed to withdraw to maintain the health of streams, rivers, wetlands in the town of Acton. So they put that limit on what we can withdraw. So in order to compensate for the increase in population, the water district has been doing everything it can to reduce the average daily water consumption in Acton. And it's doing that by doing things like installing a very aggressive leak detection program, by offering incentives and rebates on water efficient washing machines and dishwashers and toilets and such, and public education, and also putting strict regulations on summer water use. So the question that the WRAC committee has looking at this chart is what may happen when we look further out into the future, whether the water district can continue to maintain this level of demand, because it's basically pulled all the stops it can to try to reduce the average daily water consumption. So we think looking ahead 10, 15 years into the future, that this really is a concern, because when you think about the ability to the margin between demand and what can be supplied, that's really the difference between that red line and the green line on that chart, and that difference is not that large. Another number to look at is the peak demand in the summer. So when people are watering their lawns and filling their swimming pools and such, the demand goes up substantially. So in order to supply that peak demand, you need to look at what the total capacity of the water district is to supply that demand. And those numbers are shown in the upper right-hand corner. And if you look at the 24-hour pumping number, that looks pretty high compared to what the peak demand is. But the actual number that can be supplied on a constant basis is more like the 16-hour pumping number. You don't run wells 24/7. That's not healthy. So when you need to supply the peak demand, the water district can do that. But you do need to look at the difference between the peak capacity that the water district can supply and what that peak demand is in the summer. On the right side, you see some numbers about projected future capacity. So the water district is adding wells, and 2 wells will be added in the near future, which will increase that capacity. But again, the WRAC committee feels that this is something that, looking ahead 10 or 15 years, we need to be thinking about. And we just want to emphasize the point that these kinds of concerns of water supply, demand, water treatment, and the cost of water treatment are very important. Before I leave this chart, I want to point out that currently the supply capacity is diminished somewhat because in order to meet the current PFAS requirements, the water district has been forced to take a couple of the sources offline because they exceed the current PFAS standard, and to run some of the other sources at lower than normal rate. The water district has found that they can stay below the 20 part per trillion requirement by doing that, but it's been difficult to maintain that 20 part per trillion level. So the district is currently has been running pilot studies to see what works best, and in the near term is installing leased equipment to figure out the best solution for treatment. The district feels that GAC, granular activated carbon, is probably the best solution, but before they put a lot of money into permanent remediation and permanent upgrades to the existing 4 treatment plants, that they want to test some different alternatives to see what works best. So those are the approaches that the district is currently using. I want to make it clear that currently there's no supply problem, but again, looking forward another decade or so, we need to be worried about what may happen in the future. So the second chart is basically a brief tutorial on the PFAS situation, on the standards and what's happening with trying to meet those standards. So I'm showing here a log plot. Units are in parts per trillion. And PFAS, I'm sure you've all heard about this chemical. This encompasses about 2,000 types of compounds that have been around for about 50 years. So this is not a new problem. They're found everywhere in the environment, north and south poles, or in the rainwater. The reason being that these compounds have been found to be extremely useful for a lot of manufactured goods. And as Tara mentioned, they're in the upholstery and in our homes, furniture, rugs, and so forth. In fact, the estimates are that only about 20% of our daily dose of PFAS comes from drinking water. 80%, the vast majority, comes from things that are in their homes, the rugs on the floors. So whatever the water district does to get rid of PFAS in town, whatever money it spends, it's only addressing 20% of the problem. So this chart has a number of data points on it, and on the top left you see a data point indicating the current regulation for arsenic, just as a reference. Before PFAS came around, before those regulations were announced, all of the contaminant regulations were in the parts per billion level. And so the regulation currently for arsenic is 10 parts per billion, which is 10,000 parts per trillion. And because one of the reasons that PFAS is so prevalent in the environment is because its lifetime is so long. and you've probably heard it referred to as the forever chemicals. And that's one of the reasons why people become so concerned about these compounds. And about 15 years ago or so, researchers started looking more carefully into the impacts on the environment and on human health. So, in 2016, the EPA issued a guideline at 70 parts per trillion. And when I first saw that number in print, I was sure it was a misprint. That was the lowest number that I had ever seen for a water quality requirement. Almost immediately, the EPA came under criticism because they didn't make it an enforceable requirement. They just issued it as a guideline. And also there were a number of people who complained that the number was far too high. The hatched area there in the center of this plot gives you an idea of the levels of PFAS that we tend to find in rivers and streams and well water and so forth throughout the Commonwealth, and then actually throughout the United States, where we find PFAS levels in the range of 1 to 50 parts per trillion. So the fact that we're finding those kinds of levels in Acton's water is not at all surprising. Following the PFAS guideline that was issued by the EPA, a number of states decided to issue regulations, enforceable regulations. And currently about 16 states have enforceable regulations. About half of the states have either chosen to use the 70 parts per trillion number that the EPA came out with in 2016 or used higher numbers. Massachusetts is one of the few states that went to a lower number and issued a regulation at 20 parts per trillion. So that's then the number that the Acton Water District, all the suppliers, and the state of Massachusetts are working against. Prior to this point, the Water District had spent about $50 million building the 4 existing treatment plants that are currently in place. So now we're looking at additional expenses to retrofit to treat for PFAS. And last night I attended the Water District meeting. We have articles on the warrant for the spring, the Water District warrant for significant expenditures for pilot studies and asking for money for permanent remediation retrofits. My rough guess is that in order to meet the 20 part per trillion number, it's going to cost the Water District something like $20 million. That's a rough guess. That's a soft number. One of the things the WRAC committee advised me against was saying anything about monetary projections, but I think it's useful to understand the magnitudes of the numbers that we're talking about. The Water District thinks that if the numbers go lower than 20 parts per trillion, that the remediation that they install will probably work. My guess is that it may function down to something like 1 part per trillion. But going lower than 1 part per trillion, I think we're running into trouble. This past summer, the EPA decided to revise its guideline from 70 parts per trillion. And for some of the PFAS variants, it issued a guideline at the level of 4 parts per quadrillion. So that's a small fraction of 1 drop dissolved in Nagog Pond. It's an extraordinarily small level of contamination. At about the same time, the World Health Organization came out with a study issuing draft guidelines that put the numbers closer to 100 parts per trillion. So you can see the range of scientific thought on what is a safe level for PFAS. It covers a very large range. And the impact on the Water District covers a very large range. The economic impact at this point covers an extremely large range. The Massachusetts 20 part per trillion number is scheduled to be reviewed this year. The guess is that Massachusetts will lower that number, maybe down to something closer to 5 parts per trillion. Given what the EPA has just come out with, all bets are off as to what's going to happen with an EPA regulation. We think we know how to use GAC to treat down to something like 20 parts per trillion. If we go much below 1 part per trillion, we may be looking at very different technologies and much higher cost than what we're thinking about spending for the upgrades that I just discussed. Water suppliers throughout Massachusetts are looking at these numbers, trying to figure out how they're going to maintain local treatment given these kinds of regulations. And which is the reason that a number of towns have now started looking at MWRA as an alternative. So Acton, Concord, Carlisle, Littleton, Maynard, Stowe, Hudson, all are talking to MWRA about connections. There's also a group on the North Shore and another group on the South Shore that are doing the same. And so the fact that there are a lot of towns that are looking at this option is a good thing, in that that will allow us to share the cost for the connection, which will be very expensive. The negative part of that is that we're all competing for the same available resource. And one comment we've heard from people is that it would be great if we connect to MWRA because we'll have an unlimited supply of water. We can water our lawns as much as we want in the summer and all of that. That's not true. The MWRA will put strict limits on what we can take from that source. So the bottom line is that there are huge uncertainties right now as to what is going to happen in the future. The EPA was supposed to have issued a draft regulation last year. They didn't. We think that draft guideline or draft regulation will come out this year, and we just don't know where that's going to land. And so, again, there's huge unknowns as to what to do. The Water District has some big decisions to make in the next couple of years as to whether to stay with local treatment and hope for the best, hope that they can continue to keep up with these changing requirements, or to commit to a connection with MWRA and basically hand over the control of water treatment to that facility. Matt Mosteller and I have talked about this, and he has argued that if the MWRA has to treat for PFAS, it may actually be cheaper to treat on the local level. There are just so many unknowns here. So again, these are all things that we think are important to include when we think about the future. And I just wanted to bring all of these issues in front of you so that you understand better what the Water District is currently facing and the decisions that have to be made. Our Water District meetings are not all that well attended. The annual meeting may draw 30 people. We don't have the kind of visibility that you have at town meeting. And so this is the reason that we wanted to bring this to this committee, was to just share some of these issues with you.
Thank you, Mr. Parenti. We really appreciate this. If you don't mind, we may have some questions for you. I know I have plenty myself. So
okay.
First off, has the Water District received or worked up any kind of an estimate for what it might cost to hook up to the MRW?
No. When I asked the members of the district, and because coming here, I would like to have some rough numbers to just talk about. As I indicated, I think it's going to cost about $20 million to remediate down to the 20 part per trillion level. If we go below that, and we have to think about connecting to MWRA, I wouldn't put $100 million out of the question. We're talking big numbers. And, the Water District has a pretty small operational budget compared to the town. The operational budget absent debt service is more like $3 million a year. So it's a very small budget compared to the town. So these numbers are enormous compared to our operational budget.
So conceivably, we could spend $50 or $100 million to connect, and then they could run into PFAS problems and not
Right.
be able to supply us water. And I have heard elsewhere that they might already be running into PFAS problems.
We have not heard. The last I heard, it was not detectable.
Okay.
So, but the possibility is there, and certainly if the regulations are go lower, at some point they're going to detect it and have to do something about it.
Okay. Could you scroll up to his upper slide, please? So with regard to the supply capacity on upper right, where it says current, you're saying that that is our current pumping capacity? We can pump 2.4 million gallons per day over the course of 16 hours, is that right? And are there any issues with regard to our water reservoir or our groundwater? Do we typically draw it down? Is it measurable? Do we draw it down to levels where it becomes unsustainable?
There is a sensor at the intersection of School Street and Route 2 that measures the aquifer level. And I do monitor that and supply that information to the commissioners about once a month or so. There's no real danger of drawing that down to a dangerous level. You know, even after years of extended drought, we see that being replenished in the later years. So we haven't ever gotten to a situation where we feel that we're at a dangerous level. But when the aquifer levels get lower, it does get more difficult to draw out clean water, and we do look to turning off some of the wells in town, which does reduce the overall supply, capacity of the water district.
Okay. And the red line, which is the state mandated draw limit that we're supposed to.
Yes.
How is that measured? Is that by average daily volume?
Yes.
Okay.
Average daily, averaged over the year.
Okay. Wonderful. I'll open it up to the rest of the Finance Committee. Isha.
So what levels of PFAS does the MWRA remediate to?
Right now, they're not remediating. As far as I know, they do not have levels that exceed the 20 part per trillion regulation that Massachusetts has in place. So my understanding is that they're doing no current remediation for PFAS, and that at the levels, I think the detection capability of the tests that we tend to use are about 1 part per trillion. So they're not measuring it at those levels. But again, if the Massachusetts level goes lower, and if the EPA regulation goes below 1 part per trillion, I would say that it's probably likely that they will have to look at treatment for PFAS.
So is the source of the MWRA water different? That they don't really have measurable PFAS levels?
Well, the Quabbin is quite removed from the Boston area, and it's a big open water source. PFAS is widely distributed, and the levels are very widely. Mm-hmm. And there aren't any local sources that we've identified. It's hard to really understand how it gets inserted into the environment. But we find it in a lot of the areas, at the levels that I indicated, but it's not evenly distributed. So right now, the Quabbin Reservoir is not seeing measurable levels of PFAS.
I see. And is there a fee that the MWRA would implement for Acton to use its water?
Oh, yes. I mean, the water from MWRA would be much more expensive than it currently is. There definitely is a fee, and then Acton, of course, would have to still, even if we switch to MWRA, we would have to maintain the local distribution system,
right,
the storage tanks, and all of those things. So, they would charge some wholesale amount, to the water district, and then the water district would add to that to maintain its own operation.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Anderson.
My understanding is Cambridge has left the MWRA because of PFAS concerns that they've detected. They've actually switched back to their local water supply. Do you know anything about that? Because they were saying that there was PFAS in the water they were getting from the MWRA.
I'd heard that they had switched, but I didn't hear that the cause was detectable PFAS. It was.
I just found it.
Okay.
There's a Boston Globe article specifically about that. So I'm curious that it sounds like our solution might be to go to somewhere else that has the
Well,
same
I don't know where else to go.
Oh.
I mean, you know, when you look at the options, you know, we can draw it out of our wells. We can go to MWRA, or we could somehow try to get it from Nagog Pond. But, you know, the recent legal rulings have not been favorable. So there aren't a lot of options for us.
I would love to keep it local personally. Along those lines, it goes back to before this, but has there been any information you know about the change in the replenishment of the wells from the switch in South Acton to sewer from septic? My understanding is septic is nice because it...
Yes. I mean, that is an issue. That is definitely an issue. I mean, there's pluses and minuses to sewers versus septic. And you know, one of the benefits of having individual septic systems is that you do replenish the aquifer. And if you were to sewer the entire town, all of that water would be going into the Assabet. But exactly what we would be losing in terms of replenishment, I don't think we have hard numbers on
I'm
that.
just wondering in relation to the discussion about increased multifamily housing, especially around South Acton, where there is already
Yes.
the sewer, what...
I mean, there are an awful lot of things we don't have really good hard numbers on. You know, we can make guesses. Matt Mosteller's, you know, probably the best source of information on things like that. But I know, you know, we don't have hard numbers, you know, in terms of what we might lose in terms of replenishment if we expand the sewer system.
Well, I would love to know about whether there has been a change markedly over the time period of the sewer in South Acton, before and after. Would I talk to Matt to try to track that down?
I haven't heard of any noticeable difference.
And also, regarding Quabbin, I went for a hike out there in September and looked at it and said, I didn't know there was a beach around Quabbin, to which my brother, the UMass Amherst scientist, said, oh no, that's because the water level is down that low and you've never seen it before. So it's...
But they do claim to have an excess capacity. They've been talking about that for years. But it's only recently that so many towns have decided that they want to think about connecting. And as they indicated, there are pluses and minuses to that. And, you know, our allotment would be limited, and what that level might be, at this point, we have no idea.
So what I think I heard you say is that it would be most likely getting water from them, but supplementing locally also.
It's not clear whether, you know, if we connected to MWRA, whether we would maintain local treatment. Again, these are open issues. You know, Wayland has done a more complete study on connecting to MWRA because they're very close to a connection. And they have a nice study, and they look at doing local treatment only, a connection to MWRA only, or doing some combination. So we haven't gotten that far into those kinds of studies. You know, it's possible that, you know, we could throw a lot of money into one of our treatment plants and be able to treat well enough that we could supplement. We haven't gotten far enough down the road to really understand those trade-offs.
Thank you.
Mr. New?
Yeah, so help me understand how we would connect to the MWRA. I'm thinking a big pipe from Wayland or someplace like that, or maybe just down the median strip of 495. How long would that take?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that fact. 5 to 10 years are the estimates. And in the last master plan update that was done by Wright Pierce, they did suggest a route that did go down 495, down to Marlboro, I think.
So it's the traffic problems.
And Barry Rosen has pointed out that there's a fault line somewhere in there, and that's not good either. You know, we're talking about a lot of pipe, and so the hope is that we get a lot of towns involved. If we do decide to go that route, that a lot of towns are involved, and that there's a cost sharing. There's a term called wheeling, where they talk about delivering water through other towns that have connections. And I think Bedford is connected, Lexington is connected, but you just can't draw a lot of water through other towns. The infrastructure isn't there. So, if a number of local communities want to collaborate, presumably MWRA would need to build, a new aqueduct to get to this region.
Are any of our existing wells threatened by other contaminants other than PFAS?
Well,
Periodically, I know. I've lived in town a while too.
Back, as I mentioned, back in the 80s, we had the Grace issue.
Yeah.
I think that was the biggest issue that this town has faced over the years. I mean, a number of contaminants are regulated for, and so the Water District has a list of substances that it has to measure for and report on and so forth, and those are all listed in the various reports that the Water District publishes. So there are a lot of things that are regulated. There are other things that are not regulated that are in the water, like pharmaceuticals. And so, again, looking ahead, at some future time, the pharmaceuticals are regulated. We'd have to figure out how to get rid of those things. There's a real question as to whether local towns, small towns like Acton, can continue to maintain local treatment and meet all of those goals set by the regulators.
Thank you.
Mr. Rowland, no questions? Mr. Cole, do you have any questions for Mr. Parenti?
Yes, I do. And I missed the last minute because I had to go grab my food. So I apologize if this was already asked. But didn't we have a warrant article about 8 years ago to join the MWRA then?
Not to my recollection.
I believe it was right before the build out of, I think, new wells or a new station or whatever, which caused a $45 additional surcharge on every bill. It was 8 to 10 years ago. And there was a conversation then about joining the MWRA. My question is, if this comes up every 8 to 10 years, is this a case of it's inevitable and therefore we should get started now?
Well, that's a good question. I know that the commissioners and the finance committee have several times in the past looked into the possibility of connecting to MWRA, and every time they've looked into it carefully, they've said, it's just not, it doesn't make financial sense to do that. This is really the first time in the district's history that the commissioners have seriously considered connecting to MWRA. And it's all driven by the PFAS regulations that have just been established by the state, and the new ones that may be established by the federal government.
Follow-up question. You said that there are 2 new wells coming online. I believe you said that is strictly because of PFAS. Is it safe to say that the requirement to meet these lower PFAS levels are going to often or always mean that we are pumping enough to stay ahead of any population growth? Does the question make sense?
Yes, the question does make sense. That's exactly the reason I'm here speaking to you, because the RAC committee feels that that kind of question is important to address. We do have 2 new wells that will be coming online shortly, Sept 3, and then a deep rock well that's being developed. But we don't know at this time exactly what the PFAS situation will be with those new wells. When we first put the Central Acton treatment plant online, that's the latest one that's been constructed. Initially, the PFAS levels through that plant were rather low, but the announcement that just came out last week from the Water District about exceeding PFAS levels related to the Central Acton treatment plant, because as we kept pumping that water, we found higher and higher levels of PFAS. So we expect that it seems to happen that the level that was chosen by the DEP for the regulation happens to be just about where a lot of the water coming out of our ground happens to be. So we have numbers that are in the 15 PPT range, and then other numbers that are in 25. So we're right at that borderline. And
So we're not in jeopardy of not having enough water. We're just in jeopardy of not having enough water at the right ratio of PFAS.
right. I mean,
Is that correct?
what the water district is doing now is installing in North Acton. They're looking at installing leased remediation equipment for PFAS, and then on this year's warrant, they're asking for money for permanent upgrades to the South Acton and Central Acton treatment plants, so that hopefully within a year or two, the water district will be able to maintain be able to satisfy consistently the 20 part per trillion number that Massachusetts currently has in place. What the concern is the possibility that regulations either by the state or by the EPA are going to go well below the current 20 part per trillion regulation.
And my last question, I apologize if you answered it in the previous couple minutes. Why do you think this EPA goal is so draconian? Is it because they're trying to overcorrect for the fact that only 20% comes from drinking water, therefore they want to try and get 100% of the goal out of making it come from drinking water? Or is this, is there anything approaching scientific consensus as to where PFAS becomes cancerous or detrimental or whatnot? Or is the yawning chasm between the EPA recommendations and WHO recommendations, is there any reason for that?
Well, that's a very, very good question. You know, when I first saw that 70 part per trillion number that the EPA issued in 2016, I started looking more carefully into how these regulations get established. And you know, most of the regulations that are in place trace back to some animal study that was done 10 years ago with 100 rodents or something. And then they go through this very long process of trying to extrapolate from that to negative effects in humans, and they usually try to get the lifetime likelihood of something bad happening in humans down to something like 1 chance in a million. So they're going from effects that are seen in rodents over a period of a couple of months down to what might happen in humans over a period of their lifetime and down to 1 chance in a million. Exactly. The WHO. I looked. I have the report from the World Health Organization, which I thought was very well put together. One of the things that they do emphasize is, despite the fact that every popular article about PFAS that you see mentions links to cancer, the World Health Organization made it clear that in their determination, there's very, very little evidence to link PFAS to cancer. So, and all the current regulations are based on non-cancerous effects. The huge range between the World Health Organization number and the latest number out of the EPA, I cannot support. And the American Water Works Association issued a statement immediately after that latest report, a statement from the EPA asking what was the science behind that. And so I can't support that 4 part per quadrillion number that the EPA recently issued.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the Finance Committee? I do want to ask one more question about the chart on the screen, and it looks like we're at approximately 1.75 million gallons per day on average, and with the state limit at just under 2, does that mean that if we experience about 10% growth, we've hit our limit?
Well, this is a question that came up in the WRAC Committee. I mean, it looks like, if you look at this chart, it looks like, well, we can continue on this route forever. But in order to maintain, as I mentioned, in order to maintain that level demand curve, the Water District has gone to great lengths to decrease the per person usage. How long that can continue if the town continues to grow at the current rate, or if, say, an expansion of the sewer system initiates a big growth in population or brings in a lot of new businesses and so forth, which of course the town would like to see happen, what might be the impact on demand. I will say that, the town can ask the state to increase the allowable withdrawal number, but we have, at this point, I don't know that that's been done by any other town. We have no idea how successful that request might be.
Do we know what their limit is based upon?
Actually, no.
So it could be conceivable that there's plenty of groundwater for us to increase that.
It's conceivable, and if the town were to increase to the point to where we're getting very close to that line and we just can't maintain it below it, I would expect that the water district would make the request to increase that amount. But no, we've occasionally, on occasion, asked for some sort of documentation, equations, whatever, to support that regulation, and we don't have those numbers.
Wonderful. So my conjecture would be that the line is flat because we've engaged in successful water mitigation, usage mitigation techniques as the town has grown, which has allowed our water to, but eventually we run out of mitigation techniques, don't we?
Right.
Okay, wonderful. I think there are no more questions. Mr. Parenti, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, Scott, do you have any questions or comments? This is our newest member. I apologize.
I did have one question, because I look at this and I think that, by the way, thank you, it was a great presentation. I think of, if you present this and you have to think about how you have to forecast this going forward, and I look at average water demand, and I don't know if this is just common knowledge, but I think that's driven by residential and commercial. So is there a way to see this by commercial utilization of water demand and residential, and then if you split it that way, then you can look at, population in the town and how it correlates annually to the water demand, and then obviously the mitigation that's been put in place to decrease the water demand per household. But I think, I don't know what I don't know in your presentation is, has there been an impact from businesses in the town driving water demand, like coming and going? Because I think residential, I think we can all think about, okay, family of four is going to use this much and I can do this, but I would think that though, through the water district, you could see commercial utilization versus residential. You probably know that already.
We have the spreadsheets that have that information, but I don't recall that we've ever tried to do the kind of study that you're referring to. Breaking it down and looking at trends over a period of time, for instance.
Because I think you could forecast out based on housing and population in town. You could probably estimate out going forward, based on houses built, and you could probably make some type of estimation on what the expected residential water demand is. But as businesses come and go, you could get a business that's pouring water in and out, and one that's not using it.
I mean, these are, those kinds of questions are exactly the kind of thing that WRAC is interested in looking into. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've had some pushback when we've talked about studies like that, saying, these things are just not that important. The WRAC believes that they are important, and that's why I'm here.
That's all.
Air and water, two things that the human body needs almost as much as food.
I now want to mention Mrs. Tapler.
Wonderful. Mr. Parenti, thank you very much. If you have any other comments, feel free to make them now. And we really appreciate you bringing your vast knowledge and sharing it with us.
Thank you.
And we will move on. Before we move on, I believe I forgot to make our announcement at the beginning of our meeting that we have one of our members participating remotely. So just to make sure I've stated that for the record, Jason Cole is meeting remotely. If we do take any votes tonight, they will be roll call votes. Let's move on to the open space and recreation plan discussion by Christi Anderson.
I need to first make an apology. I am having a horribly upset stomach, and I believe if I leave, we lose our quorum. So if we can just rush through some stuff or figure out what can be pushed off, it would be greatly appreciated.
Wonderful. So do you want to leave that for another time?
I would like to read out
Okay.
the OSRP goals and get people to think about it. We are meeting on Thursday. I can just present back what comes out of that meeting. The goals the OSRP has based on public forums currently are, number one, protect critical environmental resources. Goal number 2 is to improve and expand recreation opportunities. Goal number 3 is to preserve historic, cultural, and landscape features. And goal number 4 is to incorporate sustainability into future open space and recreation decisions. So one question is, would we like any of that wording changed? And the other is, do we think anything should be added or removed to that?
Comments, questions? Mr. Borden?
I think when looking at open space and open parcels and the town buying open space, whether it's through CPA or other means, is that it should be contiguous with other parcels of open space. And I know that's been kind of a policy. You know, you're not going to take a 1 acre landlocked parcel that doesn't either abut or add to existing open space. Right, so I just think maybe that's, may need a little bit more in-depth analysis when parcels become available. And usually when the parcels become available, they have multiple big acres, so it probably doesn't really have that much bearing on it, but smaller things that come up from time to time do, such as the corner of Arlington and Newtown Road. There was that red house and there's a bunch of land, and they must sell out to developers, and we were able to get them to carve out and take a big chunk of that on to Grassy Pond in that area. And that's that's one example that really works well. And I just think, you know, maybe we just need to look at that a little bit more in depth through that, you know, call that out in the resource plan, you know, making it accessible, obviously. One of the things.
Thank you. Steve? Scott? Mr. Cole? Okay. Okay, thank you, Christi. Mr. Cole has no comment? Okay. Shall we move on to the town budget then? You all received the request from Mr. Mangiarotti that questions need to be in by tomorrow, I believe. I don't remember specifically what time. 12th is, what day is today? The 10th, sorry, the 12th, Thursday. I don't remember the specific time. I've already received questions from a number of you. You can send your questions to me and I will collate them and send them on to Mr. Mangiarotti. Is there anybody who's in the meeting tonight that's already sent questions directly to him, just so I would know? No? Okay. Yeah, that's the typical operation. So, do we want to divide up the budget and assign departments to folks as we've done in the past? We have 1 week between now and the budget workshop. Thoughts?
Yes.
Yes? Does somebody have the budget where we can write down?
No. I think we should, and I mean, I don't think we'll, you know, in the past, seems like I don't know if we've really done that one in the past, so to speak. We'll all just ask our questions. We've divided the warrant articles, maybe that's what I'm thinking.
I think
So-
it's a challenge, please, Steve, go ahead. No, I think it's a challenge to divide this up by department at this point in time.
Yeah,
I agree.
I just do it by article at town meeting, and just, if you go through with the budget and you see questions that you have, funnel them through you, get our answers. Like
Yeah.
we've always done the best.
I think my experience as a new member to FinCom in the past 3 years gives me good insight into this. It is nice to have a department and be able to kind of look at it with a little bit more of a magnifying glass, but I've felt that the workshops, the way that they're currently being engaged by the town, are so inclusive that it's really like you're going through the budget almost line item by line item. So I think it's simple just to take a cursory look at the budget, and if you have any specific things that pique your interest, we'll just ask questions of Mr. Mangiarotti between now and Thursday, and then Tuesday at the workshop, any further questions can be drilled down into the details. the budget is a fun process, Mr. Sullivan. You're really going to enjoy that. It actually is nice. Each one of the department heads will stand up and speak to their department, tell you what's new, what they've been doing, what kind of changes they're facing. It's really a nice overview for a new member to learn what's going on inside the town's finances. So, okay, so given that, get your questions to me, and I think we can move on to the next item. Does that sound okay? Okay. Mr. Cole, you didn't have any other questions about that, did you? Okay, wonderful. So we haven't met since November, and 2 meetings that we met together with the select board. One was for the capital improvement plan. So this is our first chance to talk about the capital improvement plan amongst ourselves if we wish to. I don't know that there's really a whole lot to discuss, but I'd like to open it up for all of you. The big item on there, of course, is the public safety building and the electrification of that, and then following that would be the library and so forth. But that's been pushed off now to fiscal year 25. So why don't I start with comments and questions from Mr. Cole?
So I had a chance to speak with Select Board member Snyder Grant on this topic, and it's important to remember that it's been pushed off to 2025, except that they are planning on moving forward with a more detailed schematic, and that's what they're looking for the money for this upcoming fiscal year. One of the points that I made with the Select Board member is that I don't want this to be a case of we've got a plan, we've got schematics, now it's time to fund the program. I'd like it to be better an opportunity to present the goals and make sure that now that it's no longer just a case of, hey, who wants to have a better environment? And of course that gets voted on as yes, that's a lofty goal. Now that we're actually talking about money and how it's going to impact people, is there still a desire to move forward? So that was sort of something I've been talking about on many projects around town. The other main point that I made to the select board member, and I would like to make sure I reiterate to the finance committee, is that I don't want to do any kind of remediation that does not have a return on investment. So for example, when we did the new twin school, we were very careful to come up with the expected number of years that it would take before we started having savings, operational savings from doing these initiatives to get to the triple net zero, for example. So one of the things that I did not like in the capital improvement plan is that it said that for each of these buildings, the emergency building, the town hall, and the library, that the operating costs would be more expensive afterwards. And I'm against that. I'm absolutely against that. There is no reason to do a capital improvement to a building to make it become operationally even more expensive. So I believe that comment landed on receptive ears. And so one of the things that he said he was going to try and make sure that he can provide for us, and I would love us to make sure we hold the line on it, is that there be a return on investment on this. So if we're able to identify predictable, locked-in electrical cost that will show operational savings over the lifespan of this building and the results of the retrofit, then I'm not against it, and I've got no arguments against it. But if you're going to spend all the money and you're still going to end up having even more operational costs for an unmeasurable goal, I'm against it, and I would like to believe that the finance committee would agree with me on that. Is that you and I had a chance to discuss this, Mr. Nolde? Is there anything else that you wanted me to make sure to bring up?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Borden.
So I reached out to the BOS and sent an article. My concern is that we go full electrification, and we know now that we do not have enough electrical capacity in this country to go full electrical. You know, what's the easiest way to do that to get more electricity? Sure, build a coal-fired plant. Nuclear is, people don't want that. That's the most efficient. Least environmental impact, but you do have spent fuel. Now, there are entities that are working on, are the ones who have taken the spent fuel that we have now and be able to refine that again and use that. And they said if we did that, we have enough electricity for 100 years. And the result of the spent fuel is that whatever comes out is not radioactive, so there's no issues there. Can it be scaled? That's the big unknown. So my concern is that we keep going more and more electric. And I'm not against it. I'm not against the environmental impacts of it. And if you just go full electric, you go, oh, great. But one is, how is that electric being generated? And do we have enough of it? If we don't have enough, now we get serious problems. Look at California last summer. They had to say, oh, you can't plug in your electric car, you can't run your air conditioning, you can't run your clothes dryer between the hours of 4 and 9 o'clock at night because the grid can't sustain it. And it's one of the big issues that we have. Our grid can't sustain it. So how do we get to that point? I don't know. It's not going to take 3 months, 6 months, or 3 years. 6 years, it's going to take 9, 12, 15 or more. And the other thing is, too, is that solar array on the transfer station, we should look at the town actually buying that so that we have control of that and that we have that, and then put a battery backup system on. So the days on the weekend when town offices are shut and it's summertime, we're generating a lot of excess capacity, we'll be able to use that at night to power our streetlights and things like that. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I just don't want the town to go rushing into something without really, really looking at the long term. How are we going to get there? And we're going to be able to, take that. And I agree with Jason. If it's going to cost us a lot more money to operate the heating and ventilation in the public safety building, the library, whatever else, we're a finance committee. We opine on financial. And we couldn't support something like that. It's going to cost more money than what we currently have. It doesn't make economic sense. So I think that's the issues that we got to grapple with as a finance committee and as a town.
Other members? Mr. Noon?
Well, some more generic comments on the long-term capital plan. I think I pointed out at the meeting that each year we've done these now, the number of, the total number increases quite a bit, in the tens of millions. The interest rates have doubled or tripled since the first one of these we did. And while it's a quantified list of wants, needs, requirements, we never do get around to stating what's the potential range of impacts on the taxpayer. We just heard from these gentlemen about some pretty staggering numbers that could potentially hit our residents from the water district. And yeah, if I wrap around your comments, Roland and Jason, about the electrification, do we want to invest in things that add to operational costs? Yet again, increasing the cost to the taxpayer. It's very difficult to look at 10 years of anything without coming back to the question of where does this, we have a revenue source and 87% of it comes from taxpayers. And, we can do all the planning we want, but we never do get around to that ultimate question, what's the impact? And I realize these things are pretty hard to estimate. In business, we would take that list and do a probability assessment on each one and then calculate the cost and the return. And it's not going to be right, it's not going to be exact, but you at least get an impact of what it's going to look like in 10 years. And that, to me, is the missing part of the plan right now.
So is it the Finance Committee's job to do the return analysis and provide it back to the town, or is it the town's responsibility to do the return analysis and provide it to the Finance Committee?
My opinion is it's the town's responsibility because we'd be making pretty wild guesses as to what the benefits might be.
Mr. Sullivan, did you have a comment? Ms. Gangali? Sorry, Mr. Rowland?
I have one more point.
Mr. Borden?
But it goes back, or whatever you want. They talk about sustainability and making sure we're going green, et cetera, but many times this past year, I've driven by the lower fields, I've driven by the courts, the softball thing on Elm Street. All the lights are on, nobody's there. And I'm like, what a colossal waste of money. You know, we're spending a fortune on lighting. In one way or another, the taxpayer's paying for it. And there's nobody using it. So better use of our resources, you know, paying attention to little things like that adds up to big dollars, especially with those things running, because they can't be the most efficient things in the world. And I think the town has to do a better job at that and monitoring those things and saying, okay, hey, we're spending a fortune here. Why are the lights on? There's nobody using it. How much does that cost an hour to run that lower fields, for example? You know, it may not be under our control, but we can put pressure on the entities that do run that, because no matter if it's the schools or if it's the town, money spent, that comes from the taxpayer.
Okay, so I agree with the sentiment mentioned with regards to rushing into switching things over to electric. I mean, I absolutely appreciate and champion the town's decision at town meeting to try to reduce our carbon footprint. But it does need to be done in an economical way, and it does need to be done in a way that doesn't put the town at further risk, right? I think back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s when we rushed to put electric baseboard heat in every house in America, and then we were ripping that stuff out at great expense in the 90s because electricity was so expensive. And if we electrified everything in this town, that's okay, but I think we need to leave, especially if the systems still work, we need to leave systems that are functioning and functionable, so that you have a choice when things get bad, because the same with the water. When everybody goes rushing to the same source of electricity or the same source of water, and there's only so much, how are you going to heat your building? So, yeah, these are things that we'll be discussing over the next year then. Certainly, I was about to make a note. Do I need to make a note to send an email to the town to ask for the ROI analysis on this? I haven't had a chance to go through the entire plan for the safety building. There might already be some ROI analysis in there in the back. Mr. Cole?
There's not. If you look even at the capital improvement plan, under each paragraph for the different buildings, it says that the expectation is this will increase the operational costs. Now, it's possible that between now and May, they're able to come up with a better plan, or they're able to come up with a better source for the electricity and can show us an ongoing proof. But currently, there is no. The ROI is negative.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Noon, can I count on you to help me word the questioning for this so that we get the appropriate answers back, so we can talk about that offline? Let's move on to the Minuteman High School. Oh, sorry.
Could we please push that to the meeting on the 24th?
Well, let me ask, how long do you think this is going to take, Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole was going to speak to this. It was generally
15
just
seconds.
questions.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
15 seconds.
So this is the email responses on Jason's questions from the Minuteman High School.
Yeah. Overall, I was very pleased to see that the vast majority of the borrowings were done within the debt exclusion. The most recent one does have an impact on our Prop 2.5 limit, any future borrowings would have an impact on our Prop 2.5 limit, although they don't expect to have any at this time. The responses I got were mainly from the financial side. They did not address whether or not they were able to lobby the Commonwealth for a better situation for those towns that stayed in the district. I would refer everyone to the email. We brought it up today so that we could make sure to share it with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments or questions from the committee? Wonderful. So that brings us to liaison reports, and I guess I could go first. There was a select board meeting last evening. Out of it, the things that I wrote down, I believe the date was February 15th is the deadline for articles to be submitted to the town. Currently, they had 0 citizens petitions. David, do you know if I have that date correct? Wonderful. That's good. There was a question in the meeting last night about the ABRSD disposition of the Gates and Douglas surplus from the construction. Mr. Cole, you might know something about this. This was an article that had just been issued yesterday prior to their meeting from ABRSD, and I think it was so fresh that there weren't a lot of details, correct, Mr. Martin? It's just a placeholder at this time, so I guess there's no reason to speak to it. It sounds like they just need to decide the disposition of any leftover funds from either the building project or the demolition project.
There won't be any.
Okay. Last night, Mr. Mangiarotti announced that they received a new federal grant for $750,000, which is allocated and named by the federal grant process directly to work on the building behind Town Hall, which I don't like to refer to by its name. But so that's a big step towards finally being able to build a plan where we can get something done with that building. And aside from that, I think there was nothing major coming from the select board meeting last evening. Any other liaison reports?
Health Insurance Trust met and confirmed the 8% increase in rates for the next year's budget.
That was what was expected, which none of us believed would be true after, what was it last year, 10% or 12%? 10%. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that good news, or better than bad news. Anybody else? Mr. Cole.
We're starting to book the PTSO point of view presentations. Rather than take the time tonight, what I'll do is I'll send out the dates that I have lined up. If you can make it in your calendar, please let me know.
Wonderful, thank you. Future meeting dates. I did send something out to the committee a while ago. I don't believe any of those dates need to change at this point. It means that currently our next meeting would be the 24th of January, but we're also meeting next Tuesday, the 17th, for the budget workshop. So don't forget that. That's also an earlier meeting that starts at, let me double check. I have so many different calendars. I have to make sure I'm on the correct one. 5:30, yes.
5:30 includes dinner.
Oh, it includes dinner, so you could probably make it by 6 or 6:15 and still be here to chime in as quorum. But right now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 5 confirmed right now, and by email I believe we had more than enough confirmed. So I expect we probably have at least 7, if not 8 of our voting members confirmed. Okay. Yeah, so for this meeting, I did it as consent items.
We'll have to make a motion.
So, oh, sorry. So let me allow Mr. Noon to make a motion then.
Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the minutes of August 9th, August 23rd, September 13th, September 27th, November 8th, November 22nd, and October 25th as submitted.
Any amendments, comments, questions? Okay, we have to take a roll call vote. I will start with Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Borden? Aye. Ms. Gangali?
Aye.
I vote aye.
Aye.
That was Mr. Noon. Ms. Anderson?
Aye.
Wonderful. And on that note, I will take one, pardon? Oh, he's not a voting member. Do I still allow him to vote?
You can let him vote on minutes.
Thank you.
Even though he wasn't at the meeting. He could still vote.
No, that's okay.
It is your duty as the newest member to adjourn.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll accept one more motion from our new member.
Adjourn? Yeah, motion to adjourn.
Okay, Mr. Cole?
Aye. Second, aye.
Mr. Borden? Aye. Ms. Gangali?
Aye.
I vote aye. Mr. Noon? Aye. Ms. Anderson?
Aye.
And we'll let you vote on this one, Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Thank you. We are adjourned.